who are you? And more importantly, in some cases, who is your patient? And this is the part in the paper where I'm going to transition, and I'm going to talk about my new work, which isn't, well, some of it's published, but some of it's coming out, and a lot of that was spurred by the invitation to come and speak here today. And what I want to do is I want to share with you some of my theoretical work about the concept of identity, and then I want to share with you how a lot of my thinking around that was challenged by the lived experience with my mother. So one of the things that I believe about identity, and not everybody believes this, and you may not believe this, and I don't know what the truth is, but many people believe that there is a core self, that there is an authentic person, and that layered upon that is life, which makes it really complicated. But then we see certain kinds of interactions as somehow threatening to that core, to that person, to the essence. And people who believe that, I think, have an image of the person which is not different from the concentric circles you see when we slice open this tree, right? And so the core is at the middle, and as you live your life, it gets layered by life experiences. But deep down, there is a real you. There is a core you. And the idea is that that comes under threat with something like dementia. And it strips away the knowledge that you have built up over the years. I stand here before you and I say, I don't believe in that theory of identity. And I could be wrong, but that's not the one that I hold on to, so it's not the one that informs what I think. The idea I have, and I don't have a really good representation, the best I could come up with is this spider web, and partly because I think persons are far more fragile, even in terms of figuring out who they think they are. I think that people are embedded in webs of relationships, and all of those relationships instantiate who they are. And I think that's easier to see in very dramatic relationships, for example, abusive relationships. The person is a function of that network that she lives in, for example. And one of the things that I think that's really important is that I want to emphasize the fact that I think that we're not bounded by our bodies in the way that the image of the tree trunk suggests. So that's what I'm going to try and explain, and that's the part that's a little bit complicated, and it's also controversial, and as I said, not everybody agrees with me. I've written about identity now for close to 15 years. The very first piece that I wrote was on identity and race. And in that article, it's called Black as Me, Narrative Identity. And I talk about what it means to claim publicly that you're a black person when you walk around in the skin that I have. My mother is the first successful case of racial discrimination in Canada under the Human Rights Code in Quebec. So if you doubt that I am black, if I do not claim my black identity, I actually insult my mother. And yet you can't read that off my body. The second piece that I wrote on identity actually looked about identity and genetics, because in the context of race issues, everybody started getting interested in ancestry tracing. And then also, genetics became a way to sort of find out about your identity, and in the context of reproductive technologies, people were arguing it's really important that you know who was your genetic parent, not just your social parent. I then wrote about identity and face transplantation. And after that, I said, you know what, Françoise, you got to pull back, and that's the kind of work that I do. You have to pull back from the mess, the morass, the lived world, and do some theoretical work and understand what is this concept of identity that you're working with, this notion of relationality. And I write this piece called I Am Who I Am, and at the same time, I write another piece called The Self in Situ, and today's new work is on identity and dementia. There's a common thread through all the work, but I'm telling you that little bit of a narrative so that you understand the context in which, if you have a theory and if the theory is robust and it can work, it has to keep working in lots of different arenas. And the most recent arena I've taken it to has challenged some of those beliefs and had me shift and change some of them. But a core belief that I have is that no one is fully independent. And to think of ourselves as these atoms bouncing around in the world, self-sufficient, is just crazy. It's truly crazy. And you know, in a way, sometimes I think bioethics has contributed to that, right? And we've contributed to that, why? Because in a Western context, we place so much emphasis on autonomy. We place so much emphasis on informed consent. And I am not saying that they are not things that are important to put emphasis on. But sometimes when you do that, or at least the way in which we write about it or think about it, we do it as if the person's disconnected from a family. I know of very few people who presented with a difficult healthcare choice are going to say, well, I don't give a damn about my family. Let me think, what do I want? I mean, people don't do that. They think about what are going to be the implications for the people who are going to have to provide care. What are going to be the implications for my children? What are going to be the implications for, you know, my community if I can't, you know, continue in my role within the community? People don't actually ever make decisions in this wholly selfish way. And the people that do that, and there are a few, we actually think of them as having some kind of mental disorder, right? So the thing that I want to say is that that view is not only false, it's significantly impoverished, and we really need to understand the importance of our relationships because they actually make us who we are. That's why, in fact, when children are young, we worry about who their friends are because we actually know and understand that that's going to influence who they become. That's why some people actually move from one neighborhood to another because they know the neighborhood they live in and the friends in that context are going to shape their children. That's why I was working in the United States, and when I had my daughter, I moved back to Canada because I realized in that context, I don't want her believing these things about the world. I don't want her making these kinds of relationships. One of the other things that I talk about in that article is that our identities are created by our interactions, by this never-engaging project that I refer to elsewhere as actions, transactions, reactions, interactions, but they're all actions. And one of the things that I think is really important is it shows you how it's interpersonal, and it shows you that in the end, the only way you can answer those questions, who are you, where are you from, not in the geographical sense, but where are you going, what do you stand for, those are all things that are grounded in your relationships and your understanding of what it is that you believe is important. Now, some people are going to see that as taking you back to the core, but I don't think that's true because I think we constantly change. And so the other thing that I hold on to with this notion of identity is that it's dynamic. And if you hold on to a view about the authentic self, you actually have a relatively static understanding of what it means to be a particular person. The other thing that I try to say, and this is the theoretical piece that comes out, where I make this claim that it's thoroughly relational, is that when I talk about this in terms of these interactions, at the end of the day, the most important features is that identity is dynamic, identity is socially, culturally, politically, and historically constituted, and then it's communicated and it is performed. The reality of it is, I can't stand here before you and imagine that I'm a university professor, that I'm successful, that I'm married, that I'm the daughter of Gloria Baylis, that I'm attractive, whatever beliefs I have. If I don't get any feedback in the world at any point in time that tells me some of those beliefs are true. If I stand here and I tell you, I'm Napoleon, can I talk to you about the war that I won? And you say back to me, well, you can't be Napoleon, you're dead. No, you don't understand. Now, you can choose to say, well, that's just mental illness. But then I can tell you a story in between those kinds of extremes. And again, what happens at some point is you give me some credence. And we work towards some kind of equilibrium between what I say I am and what you will allow me to be. And it's when that discordance is high that we have challenges. And I talked a lot about that in the very first paper that I wrote on identity and race. One of the things that I want to take you to next, though, is this very simplified idea of what I'm trying to say in sort of stranger theoretical terms, which is that at the end of the day, what the claim I'm making is that my identity is not internal to me, it's not in my body, but it's also not in my brain. So what I'm actually trying to say, I'm trying to say my identity is out here, and we are constantly negotiating my identity. I am projecting to you who I want to be and how I want to be seen, and you are in different ways giving me feedback. The fact that you haven't all stood up, walked out the room and said, who is that idiot at the top of the room? How did they let her in here? You haven't called security, right? You haven't done any of the kinds of things you would do unless you're starting to accept or buy into who it is that I'm projecting. Now, I also have support. Somebody stood up here and introduced me that way. And I brought along a CV, for example, in the abstract, right? But there are lots of ways in which I draw on the world to instantiate myself, to tell you who I am, and you act and behave in ways that allow me to continue to believe that that's true. And there might come a time when that won't happen, that I will stand up here and somebody will be sitting thinking, how very sad. She doesn't know what she's saying anymore. And maybe out of kindness, you'll let me keep speaking. And maybe not. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's a negotiated space. Now, when I say this, please understand, I don't actually imagine that any of this is overt. I actually think it's all subconscious. But it's how we live in the world, right? We have reputations. People understand that you are competent, or people understand that you are always late, or people understand that you're always dressed to the nines. And those are things that people know about you, such that when you do or behave or act differently, people are starting to think, well, they're changing. But the interesting thing is, do you think that they're under threat and they have a core self that you need to get back to, or are they just evolving? And my answer is they're just evolving. And understand, people can evolve in both negative and positive ways. So the fact that you may not like the way in which the person's transforming is completely separate from the fact that this might be who the person is today. So in that context, I wanted to say there is no truth self. There's no self in the abstract that has to be protected from the changes. And that becomes a very important claim in the context of dementia. My mother today, who she is my mother. And it doesn't matter the outward changes that people say. What makes it the same is that I know who she is. And the thing that has transitioned with dementia is that she may not know who I am. And that's one of the things that I had to look at again in the context of my theoretical work, because I imagined this as a series of actions, interactions, transactions, reactions. And what's happening is that as the person loses certain abilities, they're actually less and less of a participant in what I thought of as a co-authored biography. And what is happening and shifting over time is that my mother is contributing less and less to the telling of the story of who she is. But she still has a story because she's embedded in the stories of so many other people. And that's the thing that becomes important, because this relational identity is ultimately a narrative. So who I am, as I stand before you today, is the sum of my life. That's who I am. And that's why there can't be a core true self that I need to get back to that's under threat from this illness. I just am. I am living my life. And everything that I am today is a function of everything that I lived before. And I am embedded in my story, and I'm embedded in many other people's stories. And that's how you keep people alive. It's because they continue to be narrated into stories. This is my mother, as she has, well, this is my chronicling of my mother from the time that she knew that she had dementia. And you can see that the facial expressions have changed over time. And amongst many other things, my mother has lost the ability to smile. At this point, my mother has also lost the ability to speak. That doesn't mean that we don't communicate. In fact, I speak on the phone with her once a week. And in the early days, that you can imagine, it was extremely difficult because she couldn't make sense of a voice and a phone and a disconnection. And I'm not saying that we're having a conversation that you would recognize as a conversation, but I am on the phone. That means there's a person on the other end of the phone. So the last few slides are about my current work, where I talk about my mother as still Gloria. And this is my mother who said, I'm still a person. I've claimed in my previous work to this point that personal identity is dynamic, thoroughly relational, it's a narrative construct, it's fashioned in concert with others, and it's done in both intimate and public spaces. It's a story that's created over time with many people. And into that story comes Alzheimer's, and comes a person who now gets lost in familiar places, a person whose mind is increasingly unresponsive, and a person who has lost the skills that they once had. And so the question that I ask myself in this new work is, what does it mean to contribute to the identity constituting narrative of a person who is slowly losing her mind? And in the context of losing her mind, losing the abilities that grounded that relationship. And so what I was worried about in that context is, as you lose that ability, do you lose your identity? Is that the moment at which it's lost? And I stand before you to say, not possible. You can't lose your identity until you die, and I'm yet not sure about that. And that'll be maybe one more piece of work I need to do. I do actually believe that your identity starts before you're born, so I've done that thinking. And the reason I know that is because I can tell you all kinds of stories when I wasn't around. But they're stories that are incorporated into my life, and you may have some of those too. Yeah, oh yeah, I was a kicker, right? What do you mean you were a kicker? You know nothing about that, right? Oh yeah, but that's who I was. And it's a part because, maybe that gets instantiated. I knew you were going to be trouble. You were trouble before you were born, right? Or I knew you were going to be a musician. You love to listen to music. Like, what do you mean, right? But that's all part of the story of who you are. And you either push up against it or you embrace it. And so one of the things that I've started to do in that context is to push out my understanding of identity and really to look at three features that I think are key to relationships: memory, belonging, and recognition. And I think that this is what is important to think about. I'm just going to share with you then why I think belonging is important. And I think that it's because as a person loses their memory, they have no control over that, and you have no control over that. What you do have control over is whether you give them a sense of belonging. And what you do have control over is whether you choose to recognize them. Those are things about which we have choices. And we need to recognize that. And so in your slides, I'd put up, which I don't have here, the claim that as persons with dementia lose that relational capacity to interact with others because they are in fact losing their memory, we need to think about the relationships that remain essential in order for them to continue to be co-authors of their life. And then when we think about the issue of recognition, which again is something about which I said we have some control, it is true that persons with dementia eventually will not be able to recognize things, and then eventually they will not be able to recognize others. And I don't know whether they recognize themselves, but I think at some point it requires others to help them do that. But eventually, ultimately, I want to say that recognition is about living in the company of others. And so ultimately, recognition is dependent on us. And so as the person becomes less and less involved in their own narrative construction, I think something very interesting happens with this concept of recognition. If you look at the work of Paul Ricoeur on the course of recognition, he talks originally about recognition as identification, and then he talks about recognition as self-recognition, and lastly, recognition by others. And what I think becomes important in that context is for you to notice how it moves from the active to the passive, how it moves from being something that's cognitive and intellectual to being something that ultimately is ethical and political, and that ultimately it's up to us to grant that recognition. I want to end by reading you a very brief excerpt of my current research. And that work is grounded in the book, or references the book, Still Alice. And I'm just going to start, and that's going to be the end. Beverly Beckham of the Boston Globe writes in praise of Lisa Genova's book, Still Alice, "You have to get this book. I couldn't put it down." After I read Still Alice, which is a book of fiction about an accomplished Harvard professor with early onset Alzheimer's disease, I too wanted to tell everyone to get this book, but not because I couldn't put it down. The first time I read this book, I put it down several times to stop and cry. It was too painful for me to read in one stretch. Years back, my mother, Gloria Baylis, had been diagnosed with vascular dementia, and recently there had been findings suggestive of an atypical presentation of Alzheimer's disease. Alice Howland's story was both too familiar in terms of what I already knew and too revealing in terms of what I did not yet know. Still Alice poignantly recounts the slow progression of debilitating symptoms characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, punctuated as they are by staggering losses. This includes memory loss that disrupts daily life, challenges in solving problems, difficulty completing familiar tasks at home, at work, or at leisure, confusion with time or space, place, new problems with words and speaking or writing, misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace steps. I don't remember who told me to read Still Alice. I do remember that I wished I had read it much earlier. The book helped me to better understand the fear and isolation experienced by persons with Alzheimer's as they slowly lose their mind. This book is written from the perspective of the afflicted person, whereas many other books are written from the perspective of friends or family members, caregivers, or others. I want to believe that with a better understanding of the disease, I might have been a kinder, gentler person in dealing with my mother while she was in the early stages of dementia and merely suffering from disorientation, mental confusion, and memory lapses. Imagine getting to a place where you say merely suffering from disorientation, mental confusion, and memory lapses. In reading Still Alice, I learned how frightening Alzheimer's is for the person with the disease. And I also learned that there is a pattern to this ugly, unkind disease. Early in the book, Alice is out jogging, and for a terrifying moment, she stands at a familiar intersection, but she doesn't know where to turn to find her way home, a place she has lived for years and years. She experiences a sea of anxiety swelling furiously inside her. She's terrified at being inexplicably lost. I remember when my mother experienced similar disorientation in getting herself back home, a place she had lived for years and years. At that time, she could still use the phone and called my father to come and find her. At a later point in the story, Alice experiences frustration at not being able to make the white chocolate bread pudding that she has made every Christmas Eve since she was a young girl. As she tells her story, "I didn't make the pudding on Christmas Eve because I couldn't. I couldn't remember a single step from the recipe. It was just gone. I've made that dessert from memory every year since I was a kid." I remember the first Christmas when my mother could not accurately remember the ingredients for her traditional Christmas trifle. It was December 2007. In time, she also would not remember how to make her regular pound cake with raisins, a cake she had made without a recipe for as long as I can remember. In the throes of the dementia, Alice learns of her sister Anne's death. She's asking her daughter Lydia where Anne is, and her daughter responds matter-of-factly, "Mom, Anne's dead. She died in a car accident with your mother." Alice experiences gut-wrenching emotional pain. I quote, "Alice stopped breathing, and her heart squeezed like a fist. Her head and fingers went numb, and the world around her became dark and narrow." She began to shake and cry. Though her mother had died a long time ago, Alice did not remember this traumatic event. I remember visiting my mother at the Montreal General Hospital after she had been removed from her home and having to tell her that she was going home. And then she said to me, "I'm going home to see my mother." I responded matter-of-factly, "But Mother's dead." My mom told me in no uncertain terms that I was wrong. I knew that I was right, and I was confused by my mother's adamance. When Alice was confronted about the fact of the death of her loved ones, she could only hear her own voice in her head screaming for Anne, screaming for her mother. My mother, on hearing me speak of her mother's death, screamed aloud and shaking and crying, "Don't you think I would know if my mother was dead?" My mother had no recollection of the death that had occurred many, many years ago. In the moment, she experienced the pain of tragic loss, thinking her mother had just died. The point of telling this story is that at that stage in the relationship, I had been convinced that respecting my mother as a person required truthfulness. Thereafter, I came to understand that respecting my mother as a person required kindness above truthfulness. In the earlier stages of deterioration, well-meaning friends and caregivers started to say things to me like, "This isn't your mother," speaking or acting in the way that she was. "It's the disease. She isn't the same person anymore. You lost your mother some time ago." These comments, they were offered to me as my mother scowled at me, insulted me, threatened me, or hit me. This person, others assured me, was not my mother. After all, my mother was a person who loved me, cared for me, enjoyed my company, took pride in my accomplishments. Though well-intentioned, those who sought to comfort me in this way failed to appreciate how their confident assertions robbed my grief of meaning. Indeed, my sorrow only made sense because the woman scowling, screaming, insulting, threatening, and lashing out at me was my mother. She was not some demented woman in a wheelchair or a bed. She was the woman who had birthed me, took care of me, read umpteen drafts of my work, celebrated every one of my graduations, planned my wedding, came to help when I was birthing my children, and found myriad ways to support me and nurture her grandchildren. In closing, let me say to you, in my view, to say such things as "this isn't your mother," speaking or acting, "it's the disease," is to erroneously conflate changes, profound changes in personality with personal identity. My mother is still my mother. Her behaviors, her vocalizations may be strange, but she's no stranger to me or to others who remain in her ever-shrinking circle of belonging. My mother is not gone. She is not no longer there. And most importantly, she is not no longer a person. Thank you.